Hey guys, it's Professor Pew Pew here with another Academy video. In this video, we'll be doing a overview of the current state of the Dagger tree. Now, keep in mind that this video is made for the present, so if you're watching this video from the future, make sure you check the date of the video and read up on the patch notes to make sure that the information is still up to date. A lot has changed in Albion since I made a video that recommended the bow tree as your first weapon to max out for new players. Due to buffs to other weapons, bows are kind of falling out of favor in many areas of the game, especially in Hellgates. In 2v2 Hellgates, Quarterstaff and Baton Bow used to be a very strong combo together. And yes, you can still make Quarter Baton work in Hellgates, but it's not nearly as strong as before due to nerfs to Quarterstaff E. The Quarterstaff E can no longer hold a target still for the entire duration of the Baton Bow E, especially if you're lower spec with the Quarterstaff. So higher damage weapons like Blazing Staff, Permafrost, and One-Hand Dagger are being used more often now than Baton Bow. Warbows also used to be very popular in Hellgates, but since they buffed one-hand mace, warbows are being hard countered now by all the maces running demon boots. Maces have a lot of mobility and hard CC, and with demon boots, they become almost impossible to kite with a warbow. So you really don't see a lot of high-tier warbow players in Hellgates anymore, because the maces are so popular. Regular bow is still a good budget weapon, but it's not, and it never really was a good weapon to use in higher tier because it gets hard to counter by purges and hit and run type of builds like Quarterstaffs. Also, in the upcoming PvP balancing changes, they are talking about nerfing Ray of Light. If that change comes through, all bows will be impacted by the nerf. So if you're just stepping into the game right now and you're looking for one weapon tree to settle down into, it is my personal opinion that you should not be focusing too much on the bows anymore. Now, of course, if you already have some specs in bows, you should keep those specs. Don't spec out of it, because you never know when they're gonna buff or nerf something again and end up making bows OP in the future. But as for now, I personally don't think I would recommend the bow tree as a first weapon to max out, because it's just not as flexible as before. The reason why I recommended it before was because there was a right bow to use for every situation, every type of PvP, and now I just couldn't say that about bows anymore. But instead, I would recommend the Dagger tree. Now, a disclaimer. I don't actually play a whole lot of daggers myself. I use the one-hand dagger to do some PvE stuff and some Hellgates, but outside of that, I don't actually have much specs in daggers. So when we start talking about PvPing with a dagger, keep in mind that most of my advice comes from my experience in playing against the daggers and not so much playing as a dagger player. I will also provide a lot of links in the video description to other people's videos, so when I start talking about builds, I will give you a recommendation and you can click the link to see these builds in action. So currently, there are some dagger builds that are very strong in every aspect of the game, from PvE to PvP. The only area where dagger kind of falls short is in 5-man dungeon groups. But really, who needs a 5-man team to do a group dungeon when you can just solo a group dungeon with a one-hand dagger, right? And so we'll start with the PvE side of things. If you're a new player, this is what you are probably most concerned about anyway. So if you're a new player and you decide to use daggers for your first weapon tree to get to 400, I'd recommend that you start fame farming with a one-hand dagger. The one-hand dagger has a fairly decent clear speed in solo dungeons, but more importantly, it allows you to do some crazy stuff when you get into high specs. You can do a group dungeon solo with a one-hand dagger, and you can even solo 5v5 Hellgates if you have high enough specs in the one-hand dagger. For the build, I'd recommend using an Assassin Hood, Hunter Jacket, Spectre Shoes, Torch, and if you can afford it, a Thuffer Cape. In solo dungeons, the Spectre Shoes is just there for refreshing sprint. After you put some specs into this build, you can use this build to solo group dungeons. The Spectre Shoes is useful in group dungeons for skipping mobs because not every mob can be killed solo in a group dungeon. So against those really hard and really annoying spawns, you can use the Spectre Shoes to just sneak past them and skip over to the next mob. The video that's playing in the background right now is actually me doing a T5 group dungeon with this build. When you take this build into a solo dungeon, the Thefter Cape is very good because of its low cooldowns and high damage. But when you use it to solo group dungeons, I'd recommend using a Keeper Cape instead. A Demon Cape can also work, and the Demon Cape and the Keeper Cape are really like pretty similar in terms of damage and cooldowns. There's no really distinct advantage of one over the other. I just prefer the Keeper Cape because the Demon Cape doesn't work well when you go into certain dungeons and face certain mobs. For example, the bears in Keeper dungeons will always get off of your Demon Cape auto, and you're not going to be able to do much damage to them with the Demon Cape. The Chain Lightning from Thefter Cape is good for solo dungeons, but you should not use it for group dungeons because the Chain Lightning tends to overpull mobs that you don't really want to pull. You could also use a Morgana Cape, but it's got a higher cooldown, and due to the attack speed soft cap, it doesn't really give you as much damage as the Keeper Cape, especially if you have a Hunter Jacket. Now, like I said earlier, I'm not much of a Dagger player myself, and I have very little specs in this build, so I'm using a fairly high tier gear to make up for my lack of specs. But if you use this build to farm some solo dungeons first, and you get it to the point where you can get 1300 IP in your Dagger, you'll have no issue clearing T5 or 6 group dungeons by yourself. And you can easily hit that million fame credit per hour benchmark while you're doing group dungeons by yourself. When you get really high specs in one-hand Dagger, you can also use it to solo 5v5 Hellgates. The fame from soloing 5v5 Hellgates is absolutely insane. If you're curious about how you can solo a 5v5 Hellgate, I'll put a link in the video descriptions below to a video that shows you how to do that. But keep in mind that this hood of fame farming in 5v5s is kind of broken and will probably get nerfed by SBI in the future. Apart from the one-hand Dagger, you can also use Bloodletters to fame farm solo dungeons fairly efficiently. For that, use Bloodletter, Taproot, Spectre Jacket, Assassin Hood, and any leather shoes for Refreshing Sprint, or Scholar Sandals for mana. Soloing low-tier group dungeons is about the same fame per hour as doing high-tier solo dungeons. The main advantage in it is safety, because people usually don't dive the low-tier group dungeons, so it's much safer to farm in them than to farm T8 black zones. Also, you spend less time traveling in the open world. Going to and from the TA zone takes a lot of time. Transporting the loot back and forth also could be a hassle. Looking around for random dungeon spawns in the open world is also wasting time. When you solo group dungeons, you're going to be doing them in the low tier zones, so it saves you a lot of travel time, and because each dungeon takes a while to do, you will spend less time looking for dungeons and more time actually doing dungeons. The biggest downside to soloing group dungeons though is that you won't get much loot from it. First of all, you'll be soloing the low tier group dungeons, so even when you do open up boss chests, the loot in it is probably not going to be that great. And also, a lot of the bosses, because they're designed for 5-man teams to do, they're actually impossible to kill with a solo build. So soloing group dungeons is really just a fame farming method. It's not good at all if you need silver. The only way I can think of for you to actually profit from soloing group dungeons is if you were to do them in red zones with faction flagged. But of course, when you do that, then you lose the safety advantage because people actually do these low tier dungeons in red zones, and you'll probably run into some of them while you're faction flagged and trying to solo grind. So it won't be as safe as if you were to do this in like a black zone T5 portal zone where really there's nobody else doing these dungeons. So if silver is a little tight, then maybe doing solo dungeons in the TA zone with a bloodletter will be a better way for you to go. I will make another video later to go more in depth about solo in group dungeons with a one-hand dagger, but for now let's move on to the PvP side of things. Dagger builds in PvP are all over the place right now. Daggers are being used for every type of PvP and there are a lot of variations for builds. Let's start again with the one-hand dagger. The same build that we talked about for solo fame farming with a one-hand dagger is used often with some slight variations in 2v2 Hellgates. The best way to go about this, in my opinion, is to combine it with a quarterstaff. You can bring the same exact build but swap out the Spectre shoes for demon boots or royal sandals. If those artifacts are too expensive, just bring any leather shoes for regular run and attack speed passive. Now again, there are a lot of variations, but the idea is always the same when you run a dagger with a quarterstaff. The quarterstaff is going to stun someone for you, and you with the dagger is just going to go up there and slice them up before they can react. Some variations include, but are not limited to, using a mage robe to counter hunter hoods, using a hunter hood and cleric robe to counter cultist cows, and using Hellion hood instead of assassin hood so he can silence your target while he's rooted, and the quarterstaff can save his silence for the healer. You can also run the one-hand dagger with a healer, but when you run it with a healer, just like with any other hero composition, you'll need to bring a lot of different gear with you to swap to for facing different situations. And again, I will make a separate video that will talk about what kind of gear choices I could bring with me for swaps when I partner up with a healer. Moving away from the one-hand dagger, the dagger pairs are a solid weapon for open world content, and it's sometimes used in 5v5 Hellgates to insta-give healers. The dagger pair build used for both of these situations is Spectre Hood, Assassin Jacket, Hellion Shoes. I will put a link in the video descriptions below to my friend Starving Cat's channel. He's a very talented dagger player and he's been using this build in 5s with great success even before daggers became meta. Now, claws are, for the most part, not really used in any form of real PvP. They are mostly only used by group gankers who enjoy dogpiling one gather with 20 people. And for those situations, claws are very good because they're very easy to use. It's a point and click stun with a lot of damage. So when there's 20 of them doing it to you, there's really no way of fighting back or getting away from them. But in actual PvP, when you're fighting people on even terms and they have actual PvP builds that are not just some gathering gear, it's very easy to interrupt the Claw E and make it useless. Also, the Claw E prevents you from moving and casting channeled skills, but it does not prevent you from attacking or casting instant skills. So while you're getting clawed, you can still use spells like Cleric Robe or Guardian Boots or even a Demon Helmet plus auto attack to prevent a lot of their damage. So it's not a very good weapon for most real PvP situations. In the artifact range, all 3 of the artifact daggers are used in 2v2 Hellgates. Blackhand plus light crossbow is one of the OG one-shot combos in Hellgates. For that, people usually run Demon Helmet, Fiend Robe, or Avalonian Robe if you're a baller, but a Fiend Robe will suffice, Guardian Boots, and Theffer Cape. And your partner will run a light crossbow build. And the idea for you is to engage with your W Shadow Edge, and you stun one of the enemy players and bring them towards your crossbow player and away from their teammate with your Blackhand E or your Fiend Robe. This will separate them from their teammates, so their teammates won't be able to help as your crossbow player drops his burst on them. When you play this build, make sure your E hits at the same time as your crossbow E to ensure that the target cannot activate any defensive skills while the crossbow E goes off. It's an old school one-shot combo, and it's not really the best build for 2v2 Hellgates, but it's still very usable. The biggest downside to it though is that it's a one engage type of build. If you can't kill your opponent with one engage, most of the time you end up losing. The Bloodletter is used in 2v2 Hellgates most often now with a one-hand mace. For that combo, you'd run a Bloodletter with Spectre Jackets, Demon Boots, Hunter Hood, or Stalker Hood. The idea is pretty straightforward. The one-hand mace has a big burst, and the Bloodletter with second Q and Chain Slash W also has a high initial burst, plus the damage from the Spectre Jacket will bring your target down to below 40% health very quickly, and when they get there, just execute them with your Bloodletter E. There are some variations for this build too, of course. You can run a cloth robe with Bloodletter, Royal Sandals for extra damage, Mage Cowl, or if your name is Flaccid Baron, you can run a Cowl of Purity. And the idea is the same. You do a big burst with you do a big burst of initial damage with the Bloodletter and Mace combo, and then you execute with your Bloodletter E. And there will be a link again in the descriptions below to Flaccid Baron's channel where it will show you how this build works. The Bloodletter is also a solid weapon for open world PvP as the high mobility on it allows you to escape small groups easily. For the build, experiment with Mage Cowl, Cultist Cowl, Guardian Helmet, Mage Robe, Cultist Robe, Demon Boots, and Royal Sandals to see which ones you prefer. There's honestly a lot of variations for this, but these are a few that I've seen a lot of other people run to great effect, so picking and choosing from these would be a pretty good place to start. There's also been a lot of Bloodletters showing up for ZVZs since the Quince update and all the Zerg debuffs that came out. Because of the Zerg debuffs, it's harder now to one-shot people with ranged weapons like Brimstones, so a Bloodletter is pretty good for finishing the job with that AoE execute. For this build, run a defensive helmet like a Knight Helmet or Mercenary Hood, Spectre Jacket, whatever boots you like, Taproot offhand, and Gigantify potions. The Gigpox are very important because they minimize the self-inflicted damage from the Spectre Jacket and can help you stay alive in ZVZs. Make sure to use the second Q and dash W to maximize your mobility so you can quickly get in and out of those engages, and so you will have a easier time sticking onto your targets with the Spectre Jacket going. And finally, we'll talk about the most busted dagger of them all, the Death Givers. Death Givers are being used now in every form of PvP other than ZVZs. They're actually the meta now for crystals and 5v5s. When they made the AoE Q for Daggers, I speculated that the Death Givers will jump into the 5v5 meta, but this did not happen until later when they buffed the Chain Slash W. Now with the extra damage and invulnerability on the Chain Slash W, Death Givers are really dominating in 5v5s. They're ran as bruisers in 5v5s with a Stalker Hood, Graveguard armor or Soldier armor or sometimes Hellion Jacket, and Cleric Sandal or Cultist Sandals. I think most people are using the Cleric Sandals for the blink to safety, but honestly I think Cultist Sandals are really good too because it's just really easy to spread that debuff when you have the all the dashes that goes through people, and also with a invulnerability and a stealth on your W and 2 stealths on your E, it's very hard for people to target you anyway, so you might not even need that blink if you're really good at the weapon. Death Givers are also very strong in 2v2 Hellgates. You can run it with a healer or with another Death Giver. If you run it with a healer, the build is basically the same as if you were to run a Claymore. So you will want to bring a whole bunch of different swaps for different types of situations. If you want to know all the swaps to bring for that, I will make a separate video to talk about that because it's really too much to fit into one video. The swap meta right now is pretty crazy and people really do bring like half an inventory full of swaps when they go full tryhard. So if you want to run 2 Death Givers in Hellgates, the build is Stalker Hood, Assassin Jacket, Hellion Shoes, and the Limhurst Cape. And again, I will have a link in the video description below to Flaccid Baron's channel where you can see this build in action. The same build is also used very often in open world solo PvP. So personally, I don't prefer it over the Bloodletter because it can be hard to escape gank groups if you get caught with this build. Okay, so quick recap. One-hand dagger is good for 2v2 Hellgates and PvE. Dagger pair, not the best, but usable for 5v5s and open world solo PvP. Claws are good for group ganking. Blackhands are good for 2v2s. Bloodletters are good for 2v2s, open world, and ZVZs. Deathgivers are good for 2v2s, open world, and 5v5s. So as you can see, the dagger tree is really flexible right now. You really do have a right build for every kind of PvP. So it's a pretty good first weapon to pick if you're a new player. It's a pretty good first weapon tree to max out in its current state. Okay, so that's it for this video. I hope it was helpful, and as always, please remember to like and subscribe. And if you haven't checked out my Twitch yet, I stream every day from 5 p.m. to 10 p.m. Eastern United States time. The link will be in the descriptions below. Thank you guys for watching, and I hope to see you guys on Twitch.